follow you guys. I try to watch you do as much as you do to try to better myself and my parenting skills. So I'm trying to relay some of these messages to my daughter. So one day I was riding with Danielle, and she says to me, and we've been talking about vulnerability. She says, "Dad, what's the difference between being vulnerable and being a victim?"
Man, this is, we should, empathy has plummeted over 40%. There's tons of studies out there that show that empathy in our high school to college bound kids has plummeted over the last 30 years. That's a huge problem because the kid when you were in school who wasn't treated the right way, he or she had probably a 40 to 50% better chance of receiving empathy from his or her peers than the kids that Danielle are seeing today that have the same challenges, the same trials, the same tribulations, the same feeling of being weaker or smaller. And certainly that's in the kid's radar, is not to become that victim, that target, right, that she's talking about. Fascinating to me, and this is the question I always pose to kids first, and I love doing it in a group, and I can do it with adults, I can do it with educators, with parents or kids, or put them all together. Fascinating to me. I say vulnerability, first word that comes to your mind. First word.
First word? Scary.
Scary, right? You just did it. You did what 99% of people will do when I do this exercise in group work or circle work. I say what it is. And everyone comes up with something associated with weakness, with fear, everyone. Now, let me ask you a question. Your daughter sings, we'll pretend, right? And she's gonna get up for her first solo in front of the whole school. She's terrified, right? Is she weak?
No.
Well, what do you mean? She's scared to death. Is she weak?
No.
Now, most people associate vulnerability with weakness. And I say there's nothing further from the truth. But you know who lives in the world of vulnerability? Superheroes. They live in that world. I've seen all the movies. And they always make themselves vulnerable. That's what they do. That's the sign of strength. And our kids just don't understand that. Like, all I do is preach to my kids day and night. You gotta make yourself vulnerable. Now, you can't go off the high diving board right off the bat. You gotta just take little ones, and this is what Jason was talking about with small doses, with repeated repetition, and the role playing that we did when we talked about Thomas. But that's what we do. That's what kind of what's made us famous is our bully drill and the repetitions that we do. So taking it back to your daughter, and she says not becoming a victim, well, sure, if you just run right out across the room and make yourself vulnerable, and you've never practiced it before, and you do something outrageous to help someone that everyone thinks is this kid, yeah, you may become a victim yourself. But maybe you take small steps and you do it over and over and over again, and you build up and you build that courage and that confidence and that bravery inside of you over time by making yourself vulnerable through small moments of vulnerability.
I think when you identify yourself as a victim, or you feel like you could be a victim or be targeted, you feel unsafe. I think that when you're vulnerable, you feel uncomfortable. And that's a reframe for being brave. So I think, there's something that John Haidt in his work points out as a victim culture on college campuses, that if someone has an idea to share that's of a different political perspective, that kids on college campuses can feel unsafe. And that's not necessarily the truth. They might feel threatened, they might feel uncomfortable with that. But I think that, we have to be careful with that word safety. And victim is part of that kind of that topic in that area, but vulnerability is bravery, it's courage. And I think that our society and our culture and our kids, along with activating empathy, and vulnerability is one of the 4 areas that we activate empathy with. But I think the biggest challenges and the most headway we can make to achieving more empathetic young people is to activate vulnerability.
Let me give you a good story, because I tell it better than Jason, and it's his story. You can cut in and take it over if you want.
Okay.
But this is a good one, man. This is one of my favorite ones to talk to parents about. Jason years ago had his first transgender student, and they called him up and they said, "Hey, Carrie's coming," and
7th grader.
7th grader. and is coming and going to be in your class, and you got to deal with this. And he's like, oh geez, what the heck do I do with this? I've never dealt with this one before. It was years ago, and it was when it really started hitting, I don't want to say mainstream, do you say it like that?
Well, and you got to remember that I'm a phys ed teacher. So one of the things I'll say is, as far as transgender goes in a middle school setting in 7th grade, nobody really cares whether you're a boy or girl except in gym class, right? And certainly bathrooms. But I think we've made some big strides in all gender bathrooms and providing spaces in schools where kids can use the bathroom and, have gender not be an issue. But in phys ed, it's still a thing. So that was really where, it became quite an interesting challenge for me.
And the point is this, that I don't care if anybody watching this, I may disagree with it, the transgender movement. I mean, I may agree with it. I may think it's fine. And I don't want to muddy the water with this, the politics of it. But Carrie was going to come to school and feel extremely unsafe if the environment led to bullying, poking, prodding, hurtfulness, these things. And a kid can't learn, when cortisol is, constantly in the bloodstream. Most of those cortisol receptors are in places like the hippocampus where a lot of memory is centered. And I don't think any person in their right mind would think that 7th grader should feel scared and fearful. Whether what they believe is right or wrong, that's irrelevant to me at this point. The kid shouldn't be in school being scared to be in school. I don't know any monster that even believes that, whether you believe it's right or wrong. I don't want to overemphasize that point, but I just think it's very important for me to drill into a parent or a teacher, say, look, I don't really care what your belief is on this, because first the kid needs to be in school and he or she needs to feel safe. So Jason took this model, this Sweethearts and Heroes stuff that we were building, and he had been building a young person. And I just actually met this guy for the first time at a funeral that we were at. And subsequently met him again. And he's in 10th, 11th grade now, something like that?
10th grade.
Yeah, and so this was years ago. And Jason's got a rule that when you're in phys ed, if you're injured, you have to help coach the class. And just the ancient philosopher said, if you teach something, you learn it twice. And so he had this young man that had been working on for years to become one of these Sweethearts and Heroes. And as the beginning of the class unfolded, Jason gives this speech about being different, and this person was going to come and join their team, and they knew this person as someone different before. And after his 1-minute brilliant speech that consumed weeks and took years off of his life because he had to deliver this message for the first time to a bunch of 7th grade boys, pack animals, that are going to probably tear this thing to shreds in the real world. As he's coaching this class, kid standing next to him, and he bumps him in the elbow and says, hey, what did you think of the speech? And the kid comes out with something he'd been trained to say. I think he's brave for coming out and living by his belief, this young person that decided to announce this to the world. And Jason immediately knew game over. Because this kid was, handsome, strong, football. He's the guy that was going to throw the football as the quarterback during gym class, but he was injured. And Jason knew it was game over. And as he pulled all the kids back together at the end of the class, he said, hey, what did you think about today's class? And he agreed that he had no problem sharing that. He just stood up and said, I think Carrie's brave for being the way he's being. But that was a kid that had been trained to look over those differences and to make kids feel safe. And he made himself extremely vulnerable. But it was because Jason had been training him for years that now this person doesn't need to feel unsafe in that environment. And maybe the kid's belief system will change someday. I don't know. That's not for me to judge.